tracks around the Fearless and the sinking submarine. The rescue boats from the Fearless scattered and dodged out of the way as the destroyers carved their paths straight for the survivors. As the first destroyer passed, she slammed into the men, concussing and battering many of them, while others were sucked into the propellers and torn into pieces. The wash of the Barham swept over the sailors still standing on K-17, pushing them into the water and directly into the path of the remaining destroyers. Following close behind the Barham was the Warspite, which threaded between the ships in exactly the same way that the Barham had, but along with her came further screening destroyers, who crushed yet more survivors, and finally, the Valiant passed between them with the last group of destroyers. All three battleships have been traveling so precisely that they managed to weave their ships between the submarines without even touching their hulls. The fortune of the battleships was undercut by the deadly courses of the destroyers. As they found new paths, each one struck, drowned, and dismembered even more submariners. This continued until the entire 5th Battle Squadron had passed. After they did, the sailors aboard the Fearless and the other K-class submarines searched for men in the oily, bloody water, but of the 56 who had abandoned K-17, only 10 could be found, one of whom was gravely wounded. After bringing him aboard the Fearless, this wounded man died as well, leaving only 9. At last, the waters were clear and the ships could take inventory. The Fearless herself had been horrifically damaged, but it was clear that she was in no danger of sinking despite the gaping hole in the foresection, and so she began to limp back to Rosyth alongside the remaining K-class submarines. Back at the initial collision, K-14 and K-22 were receiving assistance from some of the screening destroyers, and one of them began towing K-14 back to harbor. K-22, on the other hand, was able to travel back on her own power, but her speed was limited by the pressure placed on the door exposed to the water in the foresection. The other ships, still scheduled to meet with the force from Scapa Flow, continued onward into the North Sea, leaving the carnage of the submarine flotillas behind them. After an hour and 15 minutes, the Battle of May Island was finished. Immediately upon the return of the damaged ships, the admirals began communicating, desperate to discover what precisely had happened. Many of the details were muddled and contradictory. Only a few things could be discerned for certain. Of the 9 K-class submarines that had left the Firth of Forth that night, 2 had sunk and 3 had been damaged to varying degrees, a casualty rate of over 50%. The Fearless had suffered crippling damage to her hull, while the Inflexible had lived up to her name and escaped with only scrapes. From the initial impact between K-14 and K-22, 2 men had drowned when water flooded into the living quarters. When K-6 had bisected K-4, every one of the 55 men aboard went down with the ship. And of the 56 who escaped from K-17, 47 of them have been smashed and shredded by the screening destroyers. No survivors were discovered after the event, and the vast majority of the corpses were lost at sea. The final death toll for the Battle of May Island was 104. The admirals agreed this matter had to be resolved both quickly and discreetly. After only 4 days, the court-martial began to determine who and what precisely was at fault. Despite the overwhelming complexity of the Battle of May Island and the myriad of conflicting reports, a basic timeline of what occurred could be ascertained, though the specific routes of certain ships remained in dispute. In particular, the inciting incident for the entire event was confounding. First, what were the 2 boats that had found themselves in the path of the 13th Submarine Flotilla, floating in the mist? Nobody with the force leaving Rosyth was informed about other ships scheduled to be in the water, and they were far too small to be enemy vessels. The immediate suspicion was that they were minesweepers, but when the man coordinating the ships at the Isle of May was brought to testify, his statements didn't align with the experiences of the 13th Submarine Flotilla. He confirmed that, while there were small ships out sweeping for mines at the time, they theoretically wouldn't have crossed paths with the ships from Rosyth. Even more mysterious, however, was the mechanical failure experienced by K-14, namely, the jamming of her helm. While the K-class was prone to sometimes extreme issues related to their construction and maintenance, there had never been a catalogued incident with the helm jamming, and nobody serving aboard the K-class ever made mention of such an incident. A thorough investigation of every mechanism from the helm to the rudder was performed, and yet, every single test came back with the same result. As things were, no cause could be found for the jam, and it could not be replicated. In the end, while a few of the officers were reprimanded, this had little to no effect on their careers, and the reason seemed clear. The event had been so embarrassing for the British Royal Navy that the Admiralty was more interested in hiding it than remedying it. No memorial was to be constructed, and no record was to be made public. To the submariners who partook in the Battle of May Island, the moral was clear. The K-class was far too awkward and unreliable. Communication technology was too rudimentary to properly coordinate with the fleet, and fleet submarines were more of a danger to their own ships than to any enemy. But to the admirals, the problem lay not with the K-class, nor with the concept of fleet submarines, only in their implementation. The performance of these large submarines after the war, however, did not bear out the expectations of the admirals. They never were to encounter the enemy beyond the one fruitless exchange of fire, and after a formal declaration of peace between the belligerents in the Great War, the K-class were assigned to posts around the Atlantic. There, however, they continued to suffer mechanical faults, and dozens of the Grand Fleet's best mariners drowned as K-class continued to sink. Even still, the admirals were keen to make use of this submarine that was meant to be one of the great achievements of the Royal Navy. As such, a few of the K-class were retrofitted to have massive 12-inch guns mounted onto the deck, recategorizing them as the M-class. This extra gun, however, made the already clumsy ships even more unwieldy. On December 12, 1925, M1 dove during an exercise and simply never resurfaced, drowning all 60 men aboard. After so many deaths due to the inadequacy of the submarines, the Royal Navy was finally forced to retire the remaining K-class, sending the majority of them in for scrap. The M-class, however, were retrofitted for new purposes. M2 was outfitted with a hangar to launch a single biplane with folding wings, while M3 was given a mine layer. But these alterations couldn't solve the extant issues with the hull. One day, while out at sea, M2 seemed to disappear entirely. Only hours later, a man aboard a ship who had seen M2 that morning casually asked if it was normal for submarines to dive backwards. He was told that it was not. It took 8 days for the search teams to discover M2 in over 100 feet of water. Her crew had all suffocated in the time it took the salvage crews to find her. It was decided that M3 would not be given the chance to drown her crew as well, and she was scrapped for her metal. The last of the K-class hulls had finally disappeared, and with them, the dream of the fleet submarine. It would be decades until the creation of another submarine that rivaled the size of the K-class, and this time, when they did, they were running under nuclear power, and their implementation would not even slightly resemble that of the K-class. Even after the war, as the files of military operations were made public, those kept about the Battle of May Island remained sealed, and the Royal Navy seemed willing only to acknowledge the most basic facts about it. It wasn't until 1994, 76 years later, that the file was released and the details made public, and in 2002, a memorial was finally constructed in Anstruther Harbor, long after everyone involved had died of old age. Now, every trace of the K-class has either been dismantled or rests on the bottom of the ocean, rusting and decaying, a fate that, to those who served aboard them, would seem only fitting.
Let